Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. had seen death in 1,000 forms across the Pacific, but nothing prepared him for Okinawa. As he surveyed the blackened landscape of Kakazu Ridge in April 1945, watching medics carry stretchers through mud thick with blood, he understood a terrible truth. Bullets could not win this war. Grenades shattered rock but left the enemy untouched. Artillery turned hillsides into moonscapes, yet the Japanese emerged from the smoke alive and defiant. The caves of Okinawa had swallowed entire companies, and from those stone throats came fire that turned American boys into statistics. Buckner needed something that could reach into the earth itself, something that could turn stone fortresses into crematoriums. He needed a weapon that did not merely kill but purged, that transformed darkness into an inferno so complete that no man could survive it. That weapon existed, carried on the backs of young men who walked into hell with tanks of jellied gasoline strapped to their spines. The Japanese called them Kaji no Akuma, fire demons. The Americans called them necessary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The island of Okinawa rises from the East China Sea like a dragon's spine, jagged and unforgiving. Its cliffs plunge into waters that had swallowed centuries of typhoons. Its interior, a maze of limestone ridges carved by ancient rivers into a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers. When the Americans came ashore on April 1, 1945, they found beaches empty and silent. No resistance, no fire, just the wind and the distant call of birds. It was the silence of a trap waiting to spring. Commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had spent months preparing his masterpiece of death. He had studied the American way of war, their reliance on firepower, their preference for frontal assault, their belief that superior numbers and industrial might would always prevail. Ushijima rejected the banzai charges that had wasted Japanese lives on island after island. Instead, he built a fortress in depth, a kingdom of stone where every cave was a bunker, every tunnel a supply route, every ridge a killing field. His soldiers did not occupy positions, they inhabited them, living like moles in a network that stretched for miles beneath the surface. The Shuri Line became the spine of this defense, a series of fortified ridges running across the southern third of the island. Kakazu Ridge, the Pinnacle, Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon, Horseshoe, names that would be written in blood. Each position was reinforced with concrete, camouflaged with brush, and connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to vanish when attacked and reappear where least expected. Machine gun nests were dug so deep that only their muzzles showed. Artillery pieces were hidden in caves with multiple firing ports, able to shell American positions from angles that made counter-battery fire nearly impossible. Spider holes dotted every slope, one-man foxholes covered with planks and dirt, invisible until a grenade came flying out or a rifle barrel emerged to pick off an exposed soldier. The Americans had faced determined defenders before. Tarawa had been brutal. Iwo Jima had been a charnel house, but Okinawa was different. Here, the enemy was invisible, fighting from beneath the ground, turning the island itself into a weapon. Major General John Hodge, commanding the 24th Corps, watched his divisions advance yard by bloody yard, each gain measured in lives. Artillery barrages that would have leveled European cities barely scratched the surface. Naval gunfire turned ridges into rubble, but when the infantry moved forward, the Japanese were still there, firing from positions that should not have existed. Private First Class Raymond Jacobs of the 96th Infantry Division remembered the first time he truly understood what they faced. His platoon had been pinned down for 3 hours by fire coming from what appeared to be solid rock. They called in mortars, watched the explosions tear apart the hillside, then advanced cautiously. As they reached the slope, fire erupted again from the exact same position. When they finally overran it, they found a tunnel system with 6 different exits, a stockpile of ammunition, and sleeping mats still warm. The Japanese had simply moved deeper into the earth and waited. The cost was staggering. In the first week, American casualties mounted into the thousands. By the second week, entire companies had been chewed to pieces trying to take single ridges. The 27th Infantry Division launched attack after attack against Kakazu Ridge, each wave breaking against defenses that seemed to regenerate overnight. Men climbed slopes under withering fire, reached the crest, and were either killed or forced back. Those who made it to the top found themselves isolated, cut off by fire from multiple directions, surrounded by an enemy that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. The Japanese defenders were not supermen. They were hungry, exhausted, cut off from resupply by American naval dominance, but they had something the Americans could not easily counter: terrain that favored defense and a willingness to die in place rather than retreat. Each cave was a fortress, each tunnel was an escape route. Each soldier was prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible, knowing that every American killed, every day of delay, brought the empire closer to negotiating a peace rather than accepting annihilation. Buckner watched his casualty reports climb and knew that time was his enemy. The longer the battle dragged on, the more lives would be lost, the more political pressure would mount in Washington. The invasion of Japan itself loomed on the horizon, and if Okinawa was any indication, the butcher's bill for the home islands would be beyond comprehension. His staff proposed bypassing the Shuri line, landing forces behind it, cutting off the Japanese from the south. Buckner rejected the plan. His logistical tail was too long, his forces too committed to frontal assault. He would grind forward, ridge by ridge, cave by cave, but grinding required tools, and conventional weapons were failing. Infantry assaults without adequate support were suicide. Artillery could suppress but not destroy. Tanks were vulnerable to suicide attacks, knocked out by men who crawled beneath them with satchel charges. The Americans needed something that could reach into the caves, something that could flush out defenders who refused to surrender, something that killed not by fragmentation, but by consuming the very air itself. The answer had been carried in the arsenals of American forces since the fighting in the Philippines, but its true potential had not been fully realized. Flamethrowers had existed in various forms since World War I, crude devices that sprayed burning liquid in short bursts. By 1945, they had evolved into something far more terrible. The M2 flamethrower was a mechanical dragon carried by a single man, consisting of 3 tanks mounted on a backpack frame. 2 tanks held fuel, a mixture of gasoline and diesel thickened with napalm, a substance developed by chemists at Harvard that turned liquid fire into a clinging gel that stuck to everything it touched. The 3rd tank contained compressed nitrogen to propel the mixture through a hose and gun assembly. When the trigger was pulled, the result was biblical. A jet of flame 40 yards long roared from the nozzle, a stream of fire so intense it could melt steel, so adhesive it could not be extinguished by water or smothered by dirt. It burned through cloth, through flesh, through bone. It sucked oxygen from enclosed spaces, suffocating those it did not immolate. It was not a weapon designed to kill cleanly. It was designed to terrorize, to break the will of defenders who thought themselves safe in their stone wombs. The men who carried these weapons were volunteers, though the term was often generous. To strap 70 pounds of jellied gasoline to your back and walk toward enemy positions required either extraordinary courage or a fatalistic acceptance of death. Flamethrower operators had life expectancies measured in minutes once combat began. They were priority targets, marked by the distinctive shape of their tanks, hunted by every Japanese rifleman and machine gunner who understood that killing the fire demon meant stopping the flame. Sergeant Thomas Callahan of the 1st Marine Division was one such man. He had joined the Corps in 1942, fought on Guadalcanal, survived Peleliu, and volunteered for flamethrower duty on Okinawa, not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. He was 23 years old, lean and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much, and a steadiness under fire that made officers notice him. When his company commander asked for volunteers to form a specialized assault team, Callahan stepped forward along with 5 others. They trained for 2 weeks, learning to maintain the temperamental weapons, to gauge distance and wind, to move as a unit with riflemen providing cover. The training was clinical, almost boring. They practiced on mock-ups of cave entrances, learned to approach from angles that minimized exposure, rehearsed the choreography of assault, covering fire, advance, flame burst, withdrawal, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of using fire as a weapon against human beings. Nothing could simulate the sound of men screaming as they burned, the smell of scorched flesh mixing with the acrid stench of napalm, the sight of charred bodies frozen in postures of agony. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Callahan's first mission came on April 19, 1945, at a position the maps called Tombstone Ridge. It was not a large formation, barely 100 yards long, but it had stopped 2 companies for 3 days. Machine guns placed in interlocking fields of fire made any approach suicidal. Mortars rained down on anyone who tried to advance. The Japanese had dug so deeply into the coral that conventional explosives barely scratched them. Battalion Command decided to send in the flamethrowers. The assault began at dawn. Artillery pounded the ridge for 30 minutes, throwing up clouds of dust and smoke. Under that cover, Callahan and his team moved forward with a platoon of infantry. They crawled through mud churned by shell craters, dragging their weapons behind them, keeping low as bullets snapped overhead. The weight of the flamethrower cut into Callahan's shoulders, the tanks shifting with every movement, reminding him that he was carrying enough fuel to turn himself into a fireball if a stray round found the wrong spot. They reached the base of the ridge and paused. Above them, barely visible through the smoke, were the dark mouths of caves. Intelligence had identified at least 4 openings, but there could be more, hidden by camouflage or vegetation. The infantry spread out, finding what cover they could among the rocks. Callahan and another flamethrower operator, a kid from Iowa named Eddie Voss, prepared their weapons. Callahan checked the pressure gauge, adjusted the igniter, and nodded to the lieutenant in charge. The signal was given. Riflemen opened fire on the cave mouths, pouring rounds into the darkness to suppress anyone inside. Callahan ran forward in a crouch, Voss behind him, moving as fast as the weight allowed. 15, 10. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from the nearest cave, kicking up dirt at Callahan's feet. He dove behind a boulder, his heart hammering, waiting for the covering fire to silence the gun. When the firing slackened, he rose and moved again, closing the distance. He could see the cave now, a black slit in the coral rock, wide enough for 2 men. He positioned himself to the side, out of direct line of fire, and raised the nozzle. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He had trained for this. He knew what to do. Callahan squeezed the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. A tongue of fire 30 feet long shot from the nozzle and lanced into the cave mouth. The flame was not red or orange, but white at its core, a searing brilliance that hurt to look at. It filled the opening, curled inside, searching for fuel. Napalm splattered against rock and pooled on the ground, burning with a thick, oily smoke. For 3 seconds, Callahan held the trigger down, sweeping the flame back and forth across the entrance. Then he released it and dropped back behind cover. The cave belched black smoke. From inside came sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Screams, not of pain but of terror. The shrieking of men who knew they were about to die and could do nothing to stop it. The screams lasted perhaps 10 seconds before they were swallowed by the roar of the fire consuming everything inside. Voss moved to the next cave, 20 yards to the right. He repeated the process, firing a burst of flame that turned the entrance into a furnace. More screams, more smoke. The ridge seemed to be bleeding darkness from a dozen wounds. The infantry moved forward, tossing grenades into openings that might still harbor defenders, firing into spider holes and crevices. Resistance collapsed. The Japanese who survived the flames either fled deeper into the tunnels or emerged with their hands raised, blackened and coughing. Tombstone Ridge fell in less than an hour. The cost to the Americans was light, 2 wounded, none killed. The cost to the Japanese was total. 63 bodies were found in the caves, most burned beyond recognition, others suffocated by the oxygen-depleted air. It was efficient. It was brutal. It was necessary. Word spread quickly through the divisions fighting on Okinawa. The flamethrowers worked. They could do what artillery and grenades could not. Within days, every regiment was requesting flamethrower teams. The weapon that had been a novelty became standard doctrine. Assault plans now included flame as a primary element, not a supplement. Engineers began mounting flamethrowers on tanks, creating mobile infernos that could approach caves under armor and unleash fire without exposing operators to direct fire. The Japanese response was immediate and desperate. Orders went out to prioritize killing flamethrower operators. Snipers were instructed to aim for the tanks on their backs. Soldiers were told to sacrifice themselves if necessary to stop the fire demons. Some succeeded. Flamethrower casualties spiked as the enemy adapted, but the psychological damage was done. Japanese soldiers who had endured weeks of bombardment, who had fought with suicidal courage, began to break when the flames came. Some abandoned their positions. Others chose death by their own hand rather than burning. Lieutenant General Ushijima watched his defense crumble section by section. His soldiers were brave, disciplined, willing to die. But fire was different from bullets. Fire was primordial terror, something that reached into the oldest parts of the human brain and screamed run. He ordered his commanders to dig deeper, to create positions so far underground that the flames could not reach. But depth had limits. Ventilation shafts became vulnerabilities. Tunnel entrances became death traps. The Americans pressed forward, not with reckless charges but with methodical violence. Each ridge was scouted, mapped, and then assaulted with combined arms, tanks, infantry, engineers, and flamethrowers working in concert. The pattern became routine. isolate the position with artillery, suppress with machine gun fire, move the flamethrowers forward under covering fire, burn out the caves, then send in infantry to clear what remained. It was slow, grinding work, but it was effective. By early May, the Shuri line was cracking. Key positions fell one after another. Sugarloaf Hill, scene of some of the bloodiest fighting in Marine Corps history, was finally secured after flamethrower teams reduced cave complexes that had resisted every other weapon. Half Moon and Horseshoe, twin ridges that had been thought impregnable, were burned out in coordinated assaults that left the coral smoking for days. The Japanese army, once a cohesive force, fragmented into isolated pockets, each fighting desperately but without coordination. Buckner's gamble had paid off, though the cost was staggering. By the time Okinawa was declared secure in late June, over 12,000 Americans were dead and 36,000 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic, over 100,000 soldiers killed, along with tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. The island had become a graveyard, its ridges and valleys littered with the detritus of war, shattered equipment, unexploded ordnance, and bodies too numerous to count. But the flamethrower had proven itself. It had turned the tide in a battle that threatened to become an endless stalemate. It had reached into the earth and dragged out an enemy that conventional weapons could not touch. And in doing so, it had revealed a terrible truth about modern war, that humanity's capacity for destruction knew no limits. That in the pursuit of victory, even fire itself could be weaponized, turned from a tool of civilization into an instrument of annihilation. Sergeant Thomas Callahan survived Okinawa. He carried his flamethrower through a dozen assaults, watched friends die beside him, and saw things that no training could prepare a man for. When the island was finally secured, he turned in his weapon without ceremony and requested a transfer to any unit that did not use fire. His request was granted. He never spoke about what he had done, not to his family, not to the men who served with him. Some things were too heavy to share. The caves of Okinawa remain, silent tombs carved into limestone, their walls still blackened by fires lit 80 years ago. Tourists visit the island now, walking trails that once ran red with blood, taking photographs of vistas that once echoed with the screams of dying men. The ridges have been given back their peaceful names, the beaches are clean, and the sea is calm. But in the darkness of those caves, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of a war that changed the world, a war where fire became the ultimate arbiter of who lived and who died, where men learned that even stone could not protect them from the fury of jellied gasoline ignited by human hands. The flamethrower was not the most powerful weapon of World War II. It did not level cities like the atomic bomb. It did not sink fleets like the submarine. But in the close, savage fighting of the Pacific Islands, it was perhaps the most feared. It represented a crossing of a line, a willingness to use elemental destruction against human beings in the most intimate and horrifying way possible. And on Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, it proved that sometimes the only way to defeat an enemy who will not surrender is to burn them out of the earth itself. The collapse of Kakazu Ridge sent tremors through the Japanese command structure that no amount of propaganda could silence. Officers who had promised their men that American firepower would break against fortified stone now faced a grim reality. Their fortress had become a crematorium. Major Seiji Nakamura, intelligence officer for the 62nd Division, compiled reports from survivors with hands that trembled despite his training. The accounts were consistent and terrifying. Fire that clung to skin, heat that melted rifle barrels, smoke so thick it strangled men before flames ever touched them. One lieutenant described watching his entire platoon consumed in seconds, their positions transformed from defensive strongpoints into ovens that cooked them alive inside their own armor. Nakamura forwarded his findings to General Ushijima with a single recommendation: evacuate forward positions before the fire weapons arrived. The general read the report in silence, then burned it. Retreat was not an option. Every meter of ground surrendered brought American bombers closer to the home islands, closer to Tokyo, closer to the emperor himself. His soldiers would hold or they would die. There was no third choice. But dying had always been part of the equation. What the flamethrowers introduced was not death, but the manner of it. Japanese soldiers had prepared themselves for bullets, for shrapnel, even for the slow agony of starvation in sealed caves. They had not prepared for fire. Ancient instincts older than civilization itself triggered when flames approached. Training dissolved. Discipline cracked. Men who would charge machine guns with nothing but bayonets fled screaming when jellied gasoline turned their bunkers into infernos. The Americans understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. Flamethrower doctrine evolved from desperation tactic to refined science. Assault teams developed choreographed movements, riflemen suppressing cave entrances while operators maneuvered into position, demolition experts sealing alternate exits with satchel charges, medics waiting just behind the line to treat the inevitable casualties. Each attack followed a pattern that maximized psychological impact while minimizing exposure. The goal was not merely to kill defenders, but to break their will, to make the very act of resistance seem futile against a weapon that turned stone shelters into death traps. Sergeant Callahan found himself at the center of this evolution. His success at Tombstone Ridge earned him a transfer to a specialized unit tasked with reducing the most stubborn Japanese positions. The 713th Provisional Flamethrower Battalion operated independently, attached to whatever division faced the toughest opposition. They trained constantly, refining techniques that balanced aggression with survival. Callahan learned to read terrain like a map, identifying approach routes that offered cover, spotting ventilation shafts that could be used to channel flame deeper into cave systems, recognizing the telltale signs of occupied positions versus abandoned decoys. His team grew into something more than soldiers. They became specialists in controlled destruction, artists of annihilation who took grim pride in their efficiency. Eddie Voss, the kid from Iowa, developed an uncanny ability to estimate fuel consumption, knowing exactly how many bursts his tanks would support before running dry. Corporal James Wu, a Nisei volunteer whose family was imprisoned in California internment camps, became the team's scout, crawling forward under fire to mark targets with phosphorus grenades. Private Leon Hayes, a former firefighter from Chicago, understood flame behavior better than anyone, predicting how napalm would flow through tunnels, where it would pool, how long it would burn. Together they assaulted positions that had stopped entire battalions. At Conical Hill, they burned out a network of caves that honeycombed the interior, working methodically from bottom to top, sealing each level before advancing. The operation took 4 days and consumed every drop of fuel the battalion possessed, but when it ended, a position that had dominated the landscape for weeks fell silent. At Yonabaru, they supported marine assaults against fortifications built into ancient Okinawan tombs, sacred sites transformed into killing grounds. Callahan hated that mission more than any other, the act of desecrating the dead to reach the living, but he did it because the alternative was sending riflemen forward to die by the dozens. The toll on operators remained horrific despite improved tactics. Flamethrowers drew fire like magnets. Japanese marksmen learned to aim for the fuel tanks, hoping to trigger catastrophic explosions. Some succeeded. Callahan watched Eddie Voss die on May 8th when a sniper's bullet punctured his starboard tank. The leak was invisible at first, just a fine mist of pressurized fuel, atomizing into the air. When Voss triggered his weapon seconds later, the spark from the igniter found the vapor cloud. The explosion was instantaneous, a fireball that consumed him so completely there was nothing left to bury. The team found his dog tags fused to a piece of coral 20 feet from where he had been standing. Replacements arrived but never stayed long. The battalion's casualty rate exceeded 50%, a number that would have been considered catastrophic in any other unit. But volunteers kept coming, drawn by patriotism, by revenge for friends killed, or simply by the certainty that someone had to do this terrible work. Most lasted less than a week. A few, like Callahan, endured through a combination of skill, caution, and luck that defied probability. The Japanese adapted as best they could with dwindling resources. Engineers constructed baffles in cave entrances, stone walls designed to deflect flame bursts. Defenders positioned themselves deeper in tunnel systems, beyond the reach of napalm, emerging only after American assault teams withdrew. Some units rigged explosives at tunnel mouths, attempting to collapse entrances when flamethrowers approached. These tactics bought time, inflicted casualties, but could not stop the inevitable. For every innovation the Japanese introduced, the Americans countered with greater firepower, more fuel, longer reach. Tank-mounted flamethrowers changed the calculus entirely. The M4A3R3, nicknamed Zippo after the cigarette lighter, carried a massive flame projector in place of its main gun. Protected by armor, it could approach positions that would have been suicide for foot soldiers. Callahan watched one demonstration with mixture of relief and unease. The tank lumbered toward a fortified cave, absorbed machine gun fire that would have shredded infantry, and unleashed a torrent of flame that filled the entrance and flowed 30 yards into the tunnel beyond. The heat was so intense that rocks cracked, the sound like rifle shots echoing across the valley. When the flame died, smoke poured from vents hundreds of yards away, evidence of how deeply the fire had penetrated. No one emerged from that cave. No one could have survived.
The Zippos were brutally effective, but few in number. The 713th still bore the burden of most assaults.
still crawled forward with backpack tanks, still gambled their lives against entrenched defenders who grew more desperate as the perimeter shrank. By late May, the Shuri line had been breached in multiple locations. Japanese forces retreated south toward the Keihan Peninsula, abandoning prepared positions for hasty defenses that lacked the depth of earlier fortifications. It should have made the fighting easier. Instead, it became more vicious. Cornered troops fought with suicidal determination. Units that had preserved themselves through months of siege now threw themselves forward in night attacks, not expecting victory, but hoping to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Banzai charges returned, despite Ushijima's earlier prohibitions, waves of screaming soldiers emerging from darkness with bayonets fixed, seeking death in combat rather than cremation in caves. The attacks were slaughtered, mowed down by machine guns and artillery, but they forced American units to remain vigilant, to sleep in shifts, to treat every shadow as a potential threat. Callahan's team was pulled from cave assault duty and reassigned to perimeter defense, a recognition that their skills were too valuable to waste on mopping up operations. They established positions along the expanding American lines, their flamethrowers pointed outward, waiting for attacks that came almost every night. The nature of combat shifted from methodical destruction to desperate survival. Japanese infiltrators probed defenses, searching for weak points. Suicide squads armed with demolition charges targeted command posts and supply dumps. The darkness became a living thing, hostile and filled with threat. On June 4th, Callahan's position was hit by a coordinated assault. Artillery fell first, poorly aimed but terrifying in its intensity, shells walking across the line in random patterns. Then came the infantry, perhaps 200 men emerging from the gloom with rifles, grenades, and nothing to lose. The American line erupted in fire. Tracer rounds drew red lines through the night. Grenades flashed like strobe lights. And in the center of the chaos, Callahan stood with his flamethrower raised, waiting for targets to close within range. They came in waves, stumbling over their own dead, driven forward by officers who knew this was the end. Callahan fired in controlled bursts, sweeping flame across the approaches, creating walls of fire that forced attackers to choose between burning or retreating into supporting fire from riflemen. The napalm ignited brush and grass, turning no man's land into a hellscape of smoke and flame. Men caught in the open burned like torches, running in circles until bullets or exhaustion dropped them. The assault broke after 20 minutes, survivors melting back into darkness, leaving behind scores of bodies illuminated by fires that would burn until dawn. When morning came, Callahan surveyed the carnage with eyes that felt too heavy to keep open. The ground was scorched black. Bodies lay in twisted heaps, some still smoldering. The air stank of burned meat and chemical residue. He had used fire to kill at range, to create barriers, to terrorize, but seeing the results in daylight stripped away any illusion about the weapon's nature. This was not clean. This was not honorable. This was simply necessary. A brutal calculus where the lives of his friends weighed more than the lives of those trying to kill them. The battle for Okinawa officially ended on June 21, 1945, when organized Japanese resistance ceased. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide rather than face capture, his final order to his men to fight to the last breath. Some obeyed, holding out in caves for weeks afterward, slowly starving until American patrols ferreted them out. Others surrendered, stumbling from tunnels with hands raised, too weak to fight, too broken to care. The island was declared secure, though skirmishes continued sporadically through summer. Callahan's war ended not with ceremony, but with paperwork. The 713th Provisional Flamethrower Battalion was deactivated, its survivors dispersed to other units or sent home on rotation. He turned in his weapon for the last time, stripped off the tanks that had become almost part of his body, and walked away without looking back. The Marine Corps offered him a promotion, a chance to train new operators for the planned invasion of Japan. He declined. Whatever came next, it would not involve fire. He shipped out in July aboard a transport crowded with wounded and war-weary veterans. Okinawa receded into the distance, a green smudge on the horizon that grew smaller until it vanished entirely. Callahan stood on deck watching until there was nothing left to see, then went below and slept for 16 hours straight, dreamless and exhausted. When he woke, the war had changed. News spread through the ship in whispers. Atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, destruction so complete it made flamethrowers seem quaint. Japan had surrendered. The invasion would not happen. The war was over. Relief mixed with something darker, a sense that the world had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Callahan had used fire to kill, had watched men burn and told himself it was necessary. Now humanity had found fire that could erase cities, that made individual suffering irrelevant beside the scale of annihilation. He wondered if future wars would even have soldiers, or if destruction would simply rain from the sky until nothing remained. The legacy of the flamethrower on Okinawa was written in ash and carbon, in caves that still bear scorch marks decades later, in the nightmares of men who survived both sides of the weapon. It proved that fortifications were not impregnable, that defense in depth could be overcome through brutal persistence and weapons designed specifically to negate natural advantages. It demonstrated that psychological warfare was as important as physical destruction, that breaking enemy morale could achieve what superior numbers alone could not. For the Japanese military, Okinawa was a preview of what invasion of the home islands would entail. The losses were unsustainable, the tactics ineffective against combined arms assault incorporating flame weapons. Strategic planners in Tokyo looked at casualty reports and understood that conventional defense could not stop the Americans. This realization, as much as the atomic bombs, contributed to the decision to surrender. Fighting to the last man sounded noble in propaganda, but Okinawa showed it meant dying by fire in holes in the ground, achieving nothing but prolonging inevitable defeat. For the Americans, the flamethrower became standard equipment in subsequent Pacific operations and later conflicts. Korea saw widespread use in bunker reduction. Vietnam expanded the concept to strategic defoliation. The weapon evolved, grew more powerful, more precise, but its fundamental nature remained unchanged. Fire projected at human beings, burning away cover and resistance with equal efficiency. Callahan went home to a country that did not want to hear about what he had done. He settled in Oregon, worked construction, married a schoolteacher who never asked about the war. He attended veteran reunions occasionally, but avoided discussing his role in combat. When his children asked what he did in the service, he said he was with an engineering unit, which was technically true. The details he kept locked away, secrets too dark to share with people who had never seen what fire could do to human flesh. In his final years, suffering from lung disease likely caused by inhaling napalm residue and smoke, Callahan granted a single interview to a military historian researching flamethrower tactics. He spoke carefully, choosing words with precision, describing procedures and outcomes without emotion. Only at the end did he allow himself reflection. The historian asked if he regretted what he had done. Callahan was silent for a long time before answering. He said he regretted that it had been necessary, that the world was such that men had to burn other men alive to achieve peace. But given the same circumstances, knowing what he knew, he would do it again because the alternative was worse. The caves of Okinawa remain, tourist attractions now, carefully maintained and sanitized for visitors who walk through them taking photographs. The scorch marks have faded but not disappeared. If you know where to look, you can still see them, black stains on limestone that no amount of scrubbing can remove. They are monuments not to victory or defeat, but to the lengths human beings will go when survival is at stake, the weapons they will create, the lines they will cross, the fire they will wield against each other in the name of causes that seem so important at the time and so distant in retrospect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.